I woke to the sharp weight of my own reflection, and for a moment I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. The room smelled faintly of detergent and something floral that wasn't mine, something that belonged to someone I wasn't supposed to be. My hands lingered over the curve of my cheeks, over the delicate slope of my jaw, and I felt a strange mixture of alarm and disbelief. How could a punishment feel like a revelation? I had always believed identity was something you inherited, shaped quietly over time by habits, family, and circumstance. And yet here I was, a man in every legal sense, being told, no, required, to present differently, to inhabit a form that felt almost alien. It started the week before, an impulsive act that I hadn't considered seriously. I'd ignored the office dress code repeatedly, stubbornly insisting my comfort mattered more than conformity. My boss, precise and unflinching, had called me into her office and, without laughter or mockery, handed down the sentence. "You will wear this," she said, holding a carefully chosen outfit, "and you will experience it for yourself." At first, I felt indignation and disbelief. The idea of being feminized, of being forced into an external identity I had never chosen, was humiliating. I imagined the ridicule of coworkers, the gnawing embarrassment during every commute, every glance. And yet, as I pulled the soft fabric over my skin for the first time, I noticed something unexpected: the way the cloth brushed against me, the careful way the outfit framed my body, and the almost hypnotic unfamiliarity of movement. I had thought of it as punishment, but there was a quiet revelation in how different it made the world seem. The morning commute felt transformed. People's expressions seemed sharper, their stares more pointed, not always judgmental, but aware, curious. I caught a reflection of myself in a shop window and froze, not out of vanity but from an unsettling sense of estrangement. Who was I, if not the sum of the expectations I had carried without question? If my outward shape could be prescribed and altered at will, then perhaps the internal structures, habits, assumptions, biases, were also malleable. At lunch, I hesitated outside the cafeteria, heart beating in a rhythm I didn't fully recognize. Every decision felt heightened: where to sit, how to speak, how to move my hands. It wasn't just the clothing, it was the consciousness of being observed, of being differently assumed by the world. A simple exchange, a request for a coffee, a comment about the weather, carried weight I hadn't anticipated. And yet, I began to notice small, subtle liberations, gestures I had ignored before, a gentleness in how people responded, a quiet curiosity instead of harsh judgment. By evening, when I returned home and changed back into my usual clothes, I realized the shift wasn't just external. The experience had forced introspection, a questioning I hadn't allowed myself before. I began to write in a journal, a habit I had abandoned long ago, documenting thoughts, emotions, and reflections. I didn't know if it was shame, growth, or simply awareness, but something inside me had cracked open. The punishment, paradoxically, was beginning to teach me about empathy, about the fragility of identity, and the invisible weight of social perception. I had imagined that being feminized would be humiliating, a surface-level mockery of my masculinity. Instead, it was teaching me to confront the assumptions I had lived under, the rigid definitions I had inherited. It was forcing me to ask uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be seen differently than I see myself? And, most importantly, how much of my understanding of others was built on my refusal to experience difference firsthand? By the time I lay down that night, dressed in my usual clothes yet feeling subtly unmoored, I understood one thing: the punishment wasn't over. It was only beginning. The next morning, I awoke with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation, like standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing the fall might hurt but also that I could not turn back. The outfit waited on a chair in my room: a soft blouse, a skirt carefully chosen for length and movement, and shoes that pinched subtly at the toes in ways that would force awareness with every step. I hated them already, and yet a small, reluctant part of me acknowledged that they made me conscious of my posture, of the way my body occupied space. I dressed slowly, deliberately, as if by paying attention I could somehow negotiate with the punishment, make it more tolerable, less invasive. The blouse smelled faintly of fabric softener, the skirt swished as I moved, and the shoes. The shoes reminded me at every step that discomfort was part of the lesson. I caught my reflection in the mirror and recoiled initially, then studied myself as if I were a scientist observing an unknown specimen. The face was mine, of course, but there was an unfamiliar softness to the expression, an awareness that had never been required before. The mirror didn't just reflect my image, it reflected the tension between who I thought I was and who I was being asked to become. Stepping outside into the crisp morning air, I felt eyes on me almost immediately. Not staring, exactly, but registering, scanning, noting the difference. I realized with a jolt that this was no longer a private exercise, it was a social experiment with myself as the subject. At first, I tried to shrink, to make my movements small and unobtrusive. But as the block passed, I noticed the subtle adjustments my body made, shoulders slightly back, chin lifted, hands held differently. The clothes were not just fabric, they were instruction, teaching me how to inhabit a form that carried expectations I hadn't earned but now had to meet. At work, the first moments were brutal. The receptionist's glance lingered longer than necessary, a small, polite smile that carried a faint curiosity I couldn't quite interpret. In the elevator, I felt every footstep echo, every movement exaggerated. When I entered my office, the receptionist gave a small nod, and I realized that even in such small interactions, my world had shifted. My colleagues treated me the same as before in tasks, but the subtle difference in their demeanor, in the micro-expressions and inflections, was undeniable. I was learning, painfully, how much perception shapes reality. During a meeting, I caught myself hesitating before speaking, weighing words more carefully than usual. I had always thought of myself as articulate, confident, even persuasive, but suddenly, every syllable carried a new weight. I noticed how I softened my voice without thinking, how I became more aware of body language, of eye contact, of tiny social cues I had previously ignored. There was a strange humility in it, a quiet lesson in restraint and attentiveness. It was almost as if the punishment had peeled away layers of habitual arrogance I had never realized I possessed. Lunch was the first real test of independence in this new form. I walked to the cafe down the street, noting how people glanced, how they calculated approachability and confidence, and how I recalibrated instinctively. I ordered slowly, enunciating each word, aware that my tone and posture were being read in ways I had taken for granted before. When a colleague from another department saw me and offered a casual greeting, I felt my chest tighten, not from embarrassment alone, but from a profound sense of being visible in a way I hadn't considered. Every interaction carried moral weight now, every smile, every nod, every word was both reflection and instruction. That evening, I returned home, exhausted in a way physical labor could never produce. I undressed slowly, folding each piece of clothing with care, examining the creases, the way the fabric held form. It was not just the punishment, it was a mirror of my own interiority. I began to journal again, this time not out of obligation but necessity. I wrote about embarrassment and liberation, about social perception and self-perception, about the ethics of understanding the lives of others by walking briefly in their shoes. I wondered how many judgments I had made silently, unconsciously, without awareness of the invisible burdens carried by those I never considered closely. In the following days, I began small experiments. I walked to the grocery store in the outfit, then to the park, then to the library. Each step felt like a negotiation with the world and with myself. Strangers' reactions varied, some were polite, some indifferent, some curious. I found myself pausing to reflect on assumptions, both theirs and mine, on the unspoken rules that govern how we perceive and categorize each other. I realized that my own shame was not inherent in the clothing, it was a reflection of fear, of internalized expectations I had never questioned. At home, alone in the quiet of my apartment, I allowed myself to notice subtle emotional shifts. There was vulnerability, yes, but also clarity. I observed how my body felt differently, how my posture, gestures, and movements subtly altered awareness and confidence. I realized that transformation was not solely physical, it was ethical, psychological, and emotional. I was learning empathy in real time, learning to understand how social cues shape identity, how public perception influences internal experience, how small acts of visibility can carry unspoken power. By the end of the second week, the punishment had transformed into a meditation. It was still uncomfortable, still a test, but I no longer dreaded it with the same intensity. Each day brought insight, about myself, about society, about the quiet ways we impose expectations and learn from them. And gradually, I understood that the core of the punishment was not humiliation, it was awareness. The blouse, the skirt, the shoes, they were instruments, not prisons. And I was beginning to hear their lesson. The mornings had begun to lose their initial edge of panic. By the third week, I woke with a strange anticipation instead of dread, a curious mixture of reluctance and readiness. The outfit still waited neatly on the chair, as if it were a silent teacher, its folds holding the quiet gravity of lessons I was only beginning to understand. I dressed slowly, deliberately, tracing the fabric with my fingers, feeling it guide my movements. Each step out the door was a negotiation with the city, with the office, and with myself. On the street, I noticed patterns I had never seen before. People's gazes weren't merely glances, they were assessments, calculations, micro-judgments I had been blind to for most of my life. A man with a briefcase looked at me and quickly averted his eyes. A group of young women passed, their whispers just perceptible, laden with curiosity and speculation. I felt my pulse accelerate, but not entirely from embarrassment. There was a strange thrill in realizing how much of life operates in unspoken codes, how much social interaction depends on assumed identities and small cues. At work, the dynamics had subtly shifted. Tasks remained the same, deadlines unchanged, but the air carried a new tension. Colleagues were polite, even friendly, yet their politeness was different. Their smiles were measured, their attention precise. I realized that my presence now carried a story, a context that existed outside of me, and it demanded negotiation. I found myself adjusting not to conform, but to communicate clearly, to exist authentically within imposed circumstances while observing the world's reactions carefully. It was during a meeting that the realization struck fully. I had prepared notes on a project, expecting the usual nods, the casual affirmations. But when I spoke, I noticed eyes flicking differently, words weighed differently. One colleague, who rarely made direct eye contact with me, met my gaze and asked a question that seemed to probe not just the project, but me. For the first time, I was acutely aware of how gender expression could subtly influence perception of competence, authority, and voice. I felt a ripple of discomfort, but it was tempered by clarity. I understood that my previous confidence had been unconsciously privileged, untested by social biases I had never felt before. After work, I began to take longer walks, as if the city itself could teach me empathy. I noticed interactions I had ignored for years, how parents adjusted children's behavior in public spaces, how strangers navigated eye contact, how unspoken judgments were layered into everyday encounters. The outfit became a lens, not just a barrier. It framed my perception, heightened my awareness, and forced me to confront assumptions I had carried without notice. I began jotting observations in a small notebook, micro-reactions, body language, the subtle choreography of respect and caution. Each note became a reflection not only of society but of my own internal evolution. One evening, I attended a casual dinner with a friend who had always been candid, unafraid of social niceties. I expected teasing, perhaps discomfort, but instead found curiosity and patience. She asked about my experience gently, not prying, and I spoke cautiously, feeling the words shape themselves carefully. "It's strange," I said, "how much I assumed I understood people simply because I wasn't directly subjected to their judgment. Walking this way, even briefly, feels like a kind of accountability." She nodded thoughtfully, and in that moment I realized the importance of dialogue, of listening, reflecting, and translating experience into empathy. At home, the process of reflection deepened. The journal grew into a narrative, a meditation. I began exploring past interactions, considering moments when I had dismissed others' discomfort or misunderstood their boundaries. I recalled colleagues whose expressions I had misread, friends whose voices I had ignored, strangers whose presence I had taken for granted. Each memory became a lens, each reflection a chance to confront unconscious bias. The punishment, I realized, was not about shame, it was about moral and social responsibility, about living with awareness rather than assumption. Sleep became another frontier. Lying in bed, I felt residue from the day, the heightened attention, the subtle shifts in posture, the constant awareness of observation. Dreams were curious. I moved through familiar spaces but felt layers of perception pressing against me, as if every glance carried meaning I hadn't considered in waking life. I awoke unsettled, yes, but also clarified, as if the subconscious was digesting lessons I could not yet fully articulate. Social encounters outside work became exercises in mindfulness. At the grocery store, I noticed how children's eyes lingered longer than adults, curious but unjudging. At the park, I saw couples and groups adjust spacing, tone, and body language, almost instinctively. I began to anticipate reactions, not to manipulate them, but to understand them. Each observation carried moral weight, an awareness that the world is not neutral, and that empathy is an active practice, not a passive sentiment. By the fourth week, a subtle transformation had taken root. The initial discomfort had not disappeared, but it had shifted from raw embarrassment to reflective consciousness. I began to notice joy in small freedoms, choosing an accessory, adjusting my posture deliberately, observing the way social interactions unfolded differently. The clothing no longer felt like a cage, but a tool, a medium for awareness, a reminder that identity is both internal and relational, that perception and reality constantly negotiate each other. The most profound moments, however, were solitary. In the quiet of my apartment, after shedding the day's layers, I studied my reflection. Not with judgment, but with inquiry. I examined my expressions, gestures, the subtle shifts in how I carried my body. I recognized fragility, yes, but also resilience. I felt a deepening empathy for people who navigate worlds that judge, assume, and categorize them constantly. I felt the weight of social expectation in new ways, and with that weight came insight. Understanding is never abstract, it is lived, felt, embodied. And yet, paradoxically, the punishment began to feel like permission. Permission to explore, to reflect, to confront the unexamined corners of my identity and moral life. I realized that this experience had forced a confrontation I would never have sought voluntarily. The discomfort, the attention, the constant awareness, they were not obstacles, they were catalysts. Each day, each interaction, each reflection was building a nuanced understanding of the self and of society, a slow, deliberate education in empathy, integrity, and accountability. By the end of that month, I no longer viewed the clothing as a punishment alone. It had become a mirror, a lens, and a teacher. I had not simply been forced into an external identity, I had been guided into deeper consciousness, into observation, into reflection. I understood, finally, that transformation was not about spectacle or shame, but about moral awareness, social perception, and emotional growth. And in that understanding, I found a strange sense of liberation, the freedom that comes not from comfort, but from insight. The mornings had begun to blur into ritual, yet each day carried its own subtle tension. Dressing in the outfit was no longer a shock to the system, it had become a deliberate, almost meditative practice. I smoothed the fabric, adjusted the hem, straightened my posture, and allowed the subtle contours of the clothing to remind me that perception is as much about presence as it is about appearance. And yet, even as routine settled in, every step outside the apartment carried an invisible weight, a constant awareness that I was not simply moving through space, I was performing, learning, negotiating, existing in a form that demanded reflection. On the street, I noticed behaviors I had previously ignored. People moved differently around me now. Conversations paused subtly as I approached, gestures adjusted unconsciously. I became acutely aware of the interplay between gender expression and social expectations, the unspoken scripts people follow, the assumptions baked into everyday interactions. I felt both exposed and alert, as though a single misstep could unravel the carefully maintained balance. And in that alertness, I discovered an unexpected humility. I realized how often I had assumed authority, competence, or confidence as my natural right, without ever considering the invisible forces shaping others' perceptions of me. Work became a delicate negotiation. Meetings felt heavier, not because of tasks or deadlines, but because every word, every gesture, every inflection carried additional social weight. I found myself pausing before speaking, questioning not only clarity but tone, anticipating interpretations I had never considered. My colleagues were patient, for the most part, but subtle micro-reactions, eye contact, nods, hesitation, taught lessons I could not have learned otherwise. I realized that presence is a dialogue, not a monologue, and that understanding the weight of perception is itself an act of moral responsibility. One afternoon, an unexpected confrontation tested this awareness. A junior colleague, unaware of the full context of my punishment, made a careless remark about my clothing. It was not malicious, only ignorant, but the words carried the power to embarrass. My instinct was to snap, to defend, to assert authority, but something in me paused. Instead, I asked gently, "Can you explain what you mean by that?" The question disarmed the interaction, and in her hesitation, I saw both recognition and apology. The moment became a lesson. Social awareness is not simply about observing others, it is about creating space for dialogue, about converting tension into understanding, about balancing accountability with empathy. Evenings were devoted to reflection. My journal grew thick with observations and musings. I wrote about embarrassment and liberation, fear and insight, humiliation and understanding. I explored not just my reactions, but the social forces shaping them, the judgments I had internalized, the assumptions I had unconsciously imposed on others, the ways in which identity is negotiated constantly, often invisibly. The act of writing became a form of moral rehearsal, a rehearsal of empathy, a method of transforming raw experience into reflective understanding. On weekends, I ventured further. Trips to the grocery store, the park, even a quiet cafe became exercises in sustained observation. Children stared openly, adults adjusted subtly. Every glance, every gesture, became data for reflection. I noticed couples subtly reconfiguring space, friends modulating tone, strangers calibrating interaction. The world, I realized, is alive with unspoken codes, and being conscious of them is itself a profound education. I began to anticipate reactions, not to manipulate, but to understand. Each encounter was a lesson in humility, patience, and awareness. One evening, I met an old friend for coffee. I expected curiosity, perhaps discomfort, but instead found careful listening. She asked about my experience with genuine interest, and I realized how much I had underestimated the value of conversation in shaping empathy. Speaking aloud about the days, the thoughts, the struggles, made the lessons tangible. I found myself articulating insights about identity, morality, and social perception that I had not fully recognized internally. Words gave shape to reflection, and in speaking, I consolidated the emotional and intellectual growth that had been simmering for weeks. There were moments of acute vulnerability. A stranger in the park asked a casual question, and I hesitated before responding, aware of how small missteps could shift perception. A colleague misread a gesture, and I felt the sting of misunderstanding. Each instance of exposure was painful, yes, but it was also illuminating. I began to understand that empathy is earned through experience, through attentiveness, through the willingness to be unsettled by unfamiliar perspectives. The punishment, once external and coercive, had become a rigorous teacher in moral awareness. At home, I spent long hours examining my own reactions. I studied my reflection, not for vanity, but for understanding, the way my expressions shifted in response to expectation, the subtle recalibration of posture and gesture, the awareness of being constantly observed. I realized that identity is never purely internal, it is relational, negotiated continuously in response to the world's gaze. And in acknowledging this, I discovered a deeper sense of responsibility, not only for my own behavior, but for the ways in which I interpreted and responded to others. By the 5th week, transformation had seeped into my thinking, not merely my behavior. I found myself reflecting on past interactions I had once dismissed, reconsidering assumptions I had never questioned, recognizing the subtle imbalances in social exchanges I had taken for granted. I became conscious of the invisible weight of perception, the ethical dimension of observation, the moral responsibility of empathy. The clothing, the outward change, was no longer the lesson, it was the catalyst for understanding, for moral clarity, for emotional depth. Evenings were quieter, yet heavier. I read articles on social psychology, watched videos exploring gender expression, studied essays on ethics and empathy. Each fragment of knowledge found resonance with lived experience. The lines between theory and practice blurred, the punishment had become a comprehensive education, a moral and emotional curriculum, teaching me lessons that could not have been learned in any classroom. And yet, for all the clarity, discomfort remained. The awareness of being observed, the subtle weight of social expectation, the constant recalibration of self in response to others, these were not burdens easily shed. They were, in fact, the very point of the exercise. I realized that discomfort is the doorway to insight, that humility is inseparable from understanding, and that transformation, true transformation, is always lived, always embodied, and always demanding. By the 6th week, I had learned to navigate the world with an attentiveness I had never possessed. I no longer flinched at glances, nor did I shrink from interaction. I walked consciously, spoke deliberately, and observed constantly, translating external experience into moral and emotional understanding. I realized that identity is both self-determined and socially mediated, that empathy requires effort, and that every encounter, no matter how small, carries ethical significance. In the quiet of my apartment, after shedding the day's attire, I studied my reflection one last time before sleep. The face in the mirror was mine, yet changed, shaped by weeks of observation, reflection, and moral engagement. I understood that punishment had transformed into guidance, coercion into insight, discomfort into moral education. I had not only experienced a shift in external appearance but a profound internal evolution. And in that realization, I found a deep, unanticipated liberation, the freedom that comes not from comfort, but from understanding, not from avoidance, but from awareness, and not from indifference, but from empathy. The weeks blurred into months, and yet each day retained its own weight. I had settled into a rhythm, a careful choreography of clothes, movement, and observation, but the underlying lessons, the moral, psychological, and social truths, continued to deepen. By now, the initial novelty, embarrassment, and sharpness of exposure had softened into a steady awareness, a consciousness of how identity, perception, and empathy are interwoven, how every interaction carries unspoken significance, and how much of life we navigate unconsciously until something forces attention. I noticed subtle changes in the way people addressed me. Some colleagues had adapted almost imperceptibly, greetings were warmer, questions more deliberate, smiles quieter but more genuine. Others remained distant, hesitant, as if unsure how to navigate the presence I now embodied. These shifts revealed to me, in ways no reading or lecture could, the silent work of social perception, the assumptions, biases, and unexamined prejudices that influence behavior. It was not judgment I felt, but curiosity and a growing sense of responsibility. If my presence could teach me insight, how could I return that awareness outward? A few friends and family began to notice differences too, not in clothing alone but in the way I moved through conversations, in the patience I exhibited, in the attentiveness I had cultivated. My sister asked one evening, over dinner, "You seem different. Like you notice things now that you never did before." I smiled, hesitant, and replied simply, "Maybe I'm learning to see what I couldn't before." The conversation lingered in my mind for days. I realized that transformation is not merely external, it radiates into relationships, reshaping dynamics, prompting reflection, and inviting dialogue. One afternoon, a minor incident at work crystallized the lessons in a powerful way. A team member, under stress, snapped at me over a deadline. Instinct would have been to respond sharply, perhaps defensively, but the awareness I had cultivated over weeks held me in check. Instead of reacting immediately, I paused, observed, and chose a calm, measured response. I acknowledged the pressure, offered a constructive suggestion, and then continued with the discussion. Later, reflecting on the exchange, I realized the shift was profound. Empathy had become operational. I was no longer responding solely from pride, fear, or habitual defensiveness. I was responding with awareness, responsibility, and moral clarity. Even the simplest moments held weight. At the grocery store, I noticed a cashier's fleeting hesitation as she scanned my items, a subtle reflection of her uncertainty or curiosity. Instead of feeling judged or awkward, I smiled, met her eyes briefly, and acknowledged her presence. The effect was almost immediate, a small nod, a gentle ease, and I felt, not pride, but a quiet satisfaction rooted in understanding. It was a lesson I had never learned in books. Awareness transforms interaction, consciousness shapes connection. By now, the reflection in the mirror had changed. I no longer recoiled at my appearance. Instead, I studied it with curiosity, with honesty, with recognition. The face and form were mine, yet they had become instruments for understanding. I observed my posture, gestures, and expressions not for vanity, but for insight into how I inhabit space and convey meaning. And I saw, with startling clarity, that identity is never singular or static, it is relational, performative, reflective, and deeply intertwined with the perceptions of others. Evenings were longer now, filled with writing, contemplation, and research. I read essays on ethics, social perception, and gender studies, not to validate experience, but to contextualize it. I wrote extensively in my journal, documenting micro-interactions, emotional reactions, and moral reflections. Each entry became a layer of insight, a way to process lived experience into understanding. I reflected on past judgments I had made unconsciously, on assumptions I had carried unquestioned, and on moments when I had failed to observe the silent work of empathy in my own life. I began experimenting intentionally with public interaction. At the cafe, I approached strangers with small questions, subtle gestures, and attentiveness, observing reactions without imposing. In the park, I engaged with children and parents gently, noticing patterns of communication, social adjustment, and subtle moral negotiation. Each encounter became an exercise in humility and reflection, a reminder that understanding is not a destination, but an ongoing practice. Work remained both challenging and instructive. I began to mentor younger colleagues with a patience I had not previously possessed. In meetings, I focused less on asserting authority and more on facilitating understanding. The social recalibration I had undergone allowed me to recognize dynamics invisible to my former self, the interplay of confidence, perception, bias, and voice. I realized that leadership, in its truest form, is relational. It requires awareness, moral responsibility, and empathy more than mere knowledge or skill. Family interactions deepened too. My parents observed the changes subtly but with clear appreciation. My mother, always attentive, remarked one evening, "You seem, kinder, more patient. You notice what others feel." I nodded quietly, reflecting that transformation is never external alone, it radiates inward and outward, reshaping not only self-understanding but relationships. Conversations that once held friction now carried curiosity and attentiveness, and I recognized the profound impact of sustained reflection on emotional intelligence. The journal entries became increasingly philosophical. I wrote about the nature of identity, the ethics of perception, the responsibilities inherent in visibility, and the moral imperative of empathy. I explored questions I had never considered deeply. How does perception shape selfhood? How much of our behavior is constrained or enabled by the assumptions of others? How can discomfort catalyze growth rather than resentment? Writing these reflections crystallized them into lived knowledge. One evening, sitting by the window with the city lights flickering, I realized that the punishment, once external, coercive, and deeply uncomfortable, had become a sustained education in moral and emotional awareness. The clothing, the social exposure, the constant negotiation of identity had forced lessons I could not have learned otherwise, lessons in empathy, responsibility, patience, observation, and reflection. The experience had shaped not only my perception of the world, but my moral engagement with it. And yet, the transformation was not complete in superficial ways. The clothing remained a reminder, but the deeper changes were internal, the ability to observe without judgment, to listen without immediate reaction, to navigate social complexity with awareness and integrity. I had developed a capacity to inhabit spaces thoughtfully, to respond to discomfort with reflection rather than instinct, and to recognize the moral weight of perception in every interaction. By the end of the 5th month, the journey had become both familiar and profound. The mirror no longer startled me, it reflected a self I recognized, yet one shaped by deliberate experience, empathy, and moral reflection. The streets, offices, cafes, and parks had become classrooms, and I had become both student and observer. I understood now that the punishment was never about humiliation, conformity, or spectacle. It was about understanding self, understanding others, and understanding the moral, psychological, and social fabric that binds us all together. I sat quietly, pen in hand, journal open, the weight of months of reflection resting gently but insistently on me. Transformation is never sudden, never external alone, and never complete in a single moment. It is a continuous negotiation, a lifelong practice of awareness, empathy, and moral attentiveness. And in that quiet understanding, I felt a profound liberation, not the fleeting comfort of safety, but the enduring freedom that comes from insight, reflection, and conscientious engagement with the world. The days had settled into rhythm, yet each day continued to teach, to challenge, to illuminate. By now, the clothing no longer shocked or embarrassed me, it had become a vessel for awareness, a mirror for reflection, and a tool for understanding. Yet despite familiarity, the lessons remained acute. Every glance, every gesture, every interaction in public spaces felt significant. I moved through the city not as an invisible observer, but as a participant acutely aware of the ethical and emotional weight of presence. I had learned, slowly and insistently, that visibility carries responsibility, not in performative ways, but in conscious ways that shape both self and others. One afternoon, I found myself waiting at a crosswalk, observing the subtle choreography of the street. People passed with varying awareness. A young man on a skateboard barely glanced at me, a mother adjusted her child's pace, subtly shielding or guiding, an older woman offered a smile, uncertain but kind. I realized then that identity is not static, not self-contained. It is relational, negotiated constantly, mediated by the perception of others, and reinforced or challenged in countless micro-moments. The awareness I had cultivated over months allowed me to interpret these moments with empathy, understanding, and, increasingly, gratitude. Work had become an entirely different experience. I had grown more attuned to team dynamics, to the subtle pressures and anxieties that shape professional behavior. I noticed a junior colleague hesitating to speak in meetings, a hesitation I would have ignored before. Instead, I asked a gentle question, created space for expression, and observed the impact. Later, I reflected on how many times I had assumed authority without recognizing the subtle social forces influencing others' confidence. The lesson was not about status or power, it was about moral attentiveness, about ethical engagement in every interaction, and about the responsibility inherent in awareness. Family life reflected these changes too. Conversations with my parents and sister were quieter, slower, yet richer. They commented less on my appearance than on my attentiveness, my patience, my reflective approach to discussion. One evening, my mother said simply, "You seem different." Not in a way I can name, but I can feel it. I nodded, understanding that the transformation was not cosmetic or superficial. It was ethical, psychological, and relational. The months of discomfort, observation, reflection, and adjustment had produced subtle but profound growth. I also began to engage more deeply with strangers, with the world beyond my immediate social and professional circles. At a library, I noticed a young woman struggling to reach a high shelf. I offered assistance, noting her gratitude but also her subtle hesitation I recognized from my own months of navigating new social perception. In that moment, I felt a resonance with experiences I had never encountered firsthand before, the weight of social assumptions, the negotiation of space, the quiet moral choices embedded in ordinary interaction. It was a vivid reminder that empathy is not abstract, it is lived, moment to moment, and action-bound. My journal, once a repository of embarrassment and reflection, had transformed into a compendium of moral insight. I wrote about perception and identity, about visibility and accountability, about the ethical demands implicit in every social interaction. I revisited old entries, noting how the shock and humiliation of early days had evolved into deliberate awareness and measured reflection. I realized that the punishment had never been about humiliation alone, it was about the cultivation of consciousness, empathy, and moral attentiveness. One evening, I attended a small gathering with friends. Conversation flowed easily, yet I noticed, almost compulsively, the subtle shifts in tone, posture, and gaze. A friend mentioned her struggles with workplace bias, and I found myself listening more than speaking, reflecting on my own experiences, drawing connections between my months of forced visibility and her ongoing challenges. I offered insights cautiously, recognizing that understanding is not equivalence, but attentive engagement. The moment reinforced the ethical core of the transformation. Moral growth is relational, it is enacted in connection with others, not merely introspection. By now, I had internalized rhythms of awareness that extended beyond clothing, beyond imposed circumstances, into the broader moral fabric of daily life. Simple interactions, ordering coffee, walking in the park, greeting colleagues, carried significance. I had become conscious of the emotional weight of presence, the subtle power of perception, and the quiet responsibility inherent in being observed. I understood that identity is not merely self-determined, it is co-constructed, fluid, relational, and ethically charged. There were moments of quiet reflection that left me profoundly unsettled but awake. I thought about past mistakes, judgments made unconsciously, dismissals offered without awareness, assumptions carried without thought. I considered the subtle ways I had contributed to discomfort, invisibility, and misunderstanding in others' lives. The months of transformation had opened a space for moral reckoning, acknowledgement, reflection, and the ongoing labor of corrective awareness. I began to see how many small acts, patience, attentiveness, recognition, carry disproportionate ethical weight, shaping the lived experience of others. At home, alone in the soft glow of evening light, I studied my reflection one last time. The face, once a source of shock and disorientation, now carried calm recognition. I observed gestures, posture, and expression with curiosity, not judgment. I noted the subtle traces of internal growth, patience in the eyes, deliberation in movement, quiet attentiveness in the way I held myself. I realized that transformation had not been about spectacle or punishment, but about the cultivation of consciousness, empathy, and moral responsibility. And yet, the journey was ongoing. Transformation, I understood, is never complete. Awareness must be sustained, empathy continually exercised, moral attentiveness practiced in every interaction. The clothing, the imposed experience, had been a catalyst, a mirror, a lens, but the enduring work is internal, relational, ethical. I could not revert to ignorance or complacency, the lessons I had absorbed demanded continual application. In the final reflection, I saw the paradox clearly. What began as punishment had become education, what began as discomfort had become liberation, what began as external coercion had become internal growth. I had been forced to inhabit an identity I did not choose, to navigate social perception in a way I had never considered, and to confront my own assumptions and biases directly. And in doing so, I had discovered a moral and emotional clarity that I would carry for life, a deeper understanding of self, of others, and of the ethical weight inherent in being seen. I closed the journal that night, feeling a stillness I had never known at the outset. The punishment had ended, but its lessons endured. I was no longer merely a man in a woman's clothing, or a subject of observation. I was a witness, a participant, a reflective observer of life's intricate social, emotional, and ethical dance. The liberation I felt was not of comfort, not of avoidance, but of understanding, hard-earned, deliberate, and profoundly human. And for the first time in months, I slept without tension, fully awake to the knowledge that identity, empathy, and morality are not inherited, assumed, or imposed, they are lived, reflected upon, and practiced in every fleeting moment of attention and care.